We have Phil Sharp, who is the president of Resources for the Future, to speak and lead off our conversation about the policy response to unconventional oil. And Phil was not only, before he was president of RFF, I think most of us know he was a congressman from Indiana for 20 years. I remember this story. One story he told was somebody asked him from one of his constituents, was, why don't you support a gas tax? We're only looking for a gas tax for 10 cents a gallon. And Phil said, you don't want me to support a gas tax. And they said, well, why not? He says, because the person who replaces me will repeal it immediately. So I don't think the politics of that has really changed that much since Phil left. So Phil, why don't you talk, and then we're going to have a presentation by Adele Morris, and then we're going to have the conversation.
Well, great. Thank you very much, David. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate being invited, and frankly, as a former member of Congress, I'm just happy to be invited about anywhere. But I wanted to quickly say that story is a myth that has been going around. I think it appears in what's his name's famous book on oil. I actually voted for the gas tax in 1978. It was a 40-cent gas tax increase, and I survived as a Democrat in a Republican district. Of course, because the tax never survived, I probably had a greater chance of surviving. And I've always believed it's one of the big political myths that the American people will not tolerate an increase in gas tax. It does depend on when you're doing it. If the prices are going up, they are not likely to appreciate additions to it. So if you pattern this well, keep it open-minded. It's always still possible in my view, but of course I have a naive view about the world. Let me quickly say that I think this conference is of great value and a critical focus, and I'm sure not everything will be resolved here today because we are at a different place and we're having to really rethink our entire energy picture through and what policies seem relevant for the various goals that we may have. Now, I'm sorry I missed the earlier parts of the conversation, so what I say may be repetitive, it may be off the wall, and if it's off the wall, please don't tell the scholars at RFF. We pride ourselves in hard-headed, independent, particularly economic analysis. That's not, I came from Congress, that's not what I'm about, and I'm going to take a little more leadway with both the facts and the analysis here, and also happy to get the criticism that goes with that. Let me just quickly also say, though, that I'm going to step back a little bit, and David Burwell actually suggested this was okay because he heard me do some of this somewhere else, and so you may not find it totally relevant, but I do think it has relevance because the energy picture is not just about oil or natural gas or nuclear or whatever we do, and we tend to have conferences along those lines. In fact, they influence each other across the way in very significant ways over time. And so I'm just going to step back and talk about the last decade and the change in the U.S. energy picture that we have seen over the last decade. And I think there's some interesting things that come out of that. First of all, what we saw over this last decade was incredible changes in technology in virtually every aspect of production, different fuels, in every aspect of distribution, in every aspect of use. And this is particularly relevant if we, as we will in a moment, go back and think how people thought things were going to be. We see it whether it's in hybrid cars and in plug-ins and diesel engines and LNG trucks. We see it whether it's IGCC plant. There are a couple, one about to open up and one under construction in the southeast United States. We see it in the design of nuclear power plants. We see it in solar and wind. In virtually every aspect of efficiency, there's been changes in this. And of course, the digital revolution itself has swept through the whole sector. And indeed, we see that the IQ of the electric grid has been going up. Nobody thinks it's reached the highest peak yet. The second big change, of course, which the oil is related to, but it's even a larger change, is what happened in the natural gas revolution in this country, in which what we see now is that the expected new supply out of the so-called shale gas development is really changing investments all across the board in the energy sector and every other sector, whether it's electric or transportation or whatnot, or at least expectations are changing. And this really came about with three of the technologies that were developed some years before. People often talk about the fracking technology and the directional drilling. What they forget about is without seismic imaging, in which you have a shot at knowing actually what's underground by your ability to see that, none of this would pay off in the same way that it is. So the second is the shale revolution. The third, of course, is that our oil imports have been declining and are expected to decline further. They were somewhere around 60% toward the beginning of the decade. They are certainly at 50% and headed south. And in part, that's because of new production of tight oil. In part, it's because of production and market absorption of ethanol into the system. And in part, because of vehicle efficiency that has been significantly improving and projected to improve. The fourth change in the picture is, of course, that our CO2 emissions trajectory has flattened out and even declined, and this was not expected. In part, this is because of the recession. We always diminish any kind of environmental pollution when we get into recession, so there's always a solution to the environmental problem, not one we particularly like. We also saw the immediate dispatch as the natural gas supplies dropped in price and came available. The electric system had been overbuilt in terms of generation capacity of gas-fired plants, and those were easily switched on or accelerated the use of, and so we saw a significant shift in the daily production of electricity from coal into to gas, and of course now there's lots of talk about what will be built further in this sector, and gas certainly has a strong edge over most everything else. The third part of what we saw in these emissions, of course, was the fact that we appear to have gotten a lot more efficient across the board in a variety of ways, including obviously in vehicle transportation. As you may know, one of our scholars at RFF, Dallas Bertraw, has projected that there's a strong possibility that by 2020 we'll actually come very close to meeting the goal of that we set at Copenhagen, the 17% pledge of reducing CO2 emissions relative to the 2005 base. And part of that, of course, is he's counting in there the expected influence of the various policies at EPA, some that directly affect coal and some that affect the new power plant construction in the country. But of course, on CO2, we still have no clear international path forward, and we have no clear domestic path forward in terms of long-term reductions. Now, if we look at the factors that led to this change, it's very hard in any one thing to pull out the thing and to make it the cause and effect relationship sometimes. But I think there are sort of four broad categories that these fall into. And lots of people like to exclude one or the other that doesn't ideologically favor their point of view of the world, and that's why I think it's relevant to go over them. One is that prices. The price of oil and natural gas, if you go back to the 2000 year, sometime around then, natural gas had started to rise rather unexpectedly and very significantly in this country, reshaping people's thinking about where that would be and having an influence in the marketplace. It was followed a couple of years later by the international price of oil going up and both staying up, which of course is the big thing. When prices go up and down, everybody gets shaken, but they adjust. But when they make a significant change, it has a major impact on investor behavior and on consumer behavior. And one of the things that we need to learn, and we hope we have learned from the 1970s, is the notion that consumers will not change from price is just the biggest bunch of baloney ever. It's just how long it takes them to change, and what is the pain level, and whether it's fair or unfair. But the denial of this proposition that was very common among some circles in the 1970s when we dealt with energy, I hope has been diminished kind of proposition. That doesn't mean it's always the right course of action, but believe you me, it gets action. And very significantly, it always gets political action. It's like putting a blowtorch on the rear end of Congress. When the prices go up, they scramble for all kinds of policies that in theory are going to change our energy picture in the future, and almost always the articulation of it is it will mean in the future you won't have to pay the same prices that you are paying now. And sometimes that actually has truth in it. The second big proposition here is the entrepreneurial risk-taking that is involved in virtually every sector that has helped to bring about this change. We all kind of know about it, I think, in the natural gas story, where it was the independent gas drillers. Not that they're so poor people, but they aren't Exxons and they aren't ConocoPhillips and whatnot. These small guys got out there, placed the bets, millions of dollars of bets on being able to economically frack the rock and get the gas out in an economical way. They did that because the natural gas price was high and very attractive if you could be successful. They did it because they believed in it. They did it because they wanted to drive and have an impact. And they did it against the conventional wisdom of the big companies that we have been hearing about, who frankly often poo-pooed the whole idea that this had any significant place and you wouldn't put your bets in this place. But we saw this on the solar energy investments. We saw it with wind. We saw it across the board where it takes. Now, this is important, and we give lip service to it, but it needs to be recognized when you're making policy in this country, and it needs to be recognized about what we think is the pace of development other places in the world. Because the issue, both here and there, is, are there cultural impediments to actually taking risks? Are there institutional impediments to taking risks? And of course, you're always up against the conventional or the incumbent technology when you're trying to bring about change. And so it's a serious risk. And if you don't have a way to reward that, you're likely to have very slow development. And what we see happening in a number of places in Europe and even in China, the government appears to have a policy in which they want to drive this. I've been told by a couple of big oil company economists, they said, who do work there, they said, yeah, but it's going to be slow because the government may want it to do it, but the incentive systems and structures are not in place to make the companies that the government owns want to do it with the same vigor. And there isn't like here where you can go out, whether it's the promised land or not, I haven't seen the movie, and make a deal with a landowner and get it underway, kind of proposition. So how far it develops abroad will depend in part on this issue of entrepreneurial risk-taking and the impediments to it. Third proposition that has brought about this change was decades of research and development paid for in part by the federal government, a few state governments, part by the private sector. It's all over the lot. Well, let me tell you, that stuff actually began to pay off. I mentioned 3D seismic. We mentioned, I'm not sure whether they were invested in, I think they did invest in fracking. They certainly invested in directional drilling, auto efficiency, batteries, and wind and solar cost reductions, in new nuclear plant designs. All of these kind of things, in one way or another, to some degree, have been sustained over the last 30 years. It's been on, not totally on again, off again, but up and down in terms of the quantity. A kind of proposition. Now, the fourth thing that, of course, has driven this is actual federal and state policies designed to get these technologies into the marketplace or to push them into the marketplace. Those policies always work best when the price is also helping to get it in there. Otherwise, you're fighting price. If you're trying to subsidize something massively to overcome the price differential, it's a whale of a lot more difficult policy to carry out and likely to be less successful than if you're lucky to have oil and gas prices going up like this, and so everybody says, good idea, and we're willing to pay the difference. But anyway, the policies prior to 2000, there weren't a lot of policies left on the books out of the 70s, but we put the PTC, the production tax credit, in place in 1990, and that clearly, along with state RPS systems, renewable portfolio standards, which require the electric utility system to buy certain, use certain resources in production electricity, those clearly help get the wind proposition started, so that from a very low base, it was the highest new increment of power in the country for a number of years, but it was extremely low base at first. By mid-decade, and especially with those high prices and the political action that were generated not only at the federal government and state level, we just saw very significant, in fact, the most significant intervention by the federal government in the energy markets in this country since the Carter years. and by the way, it was on a bipartisan basis, often supported by a Republican president, all define the sort of political logic of the opening of the decade. And yeah, as you know, in 2005, we had a major so-called comprehensive energy bill. We had another one in 2007, and in 2009, as a major part of the investment package for the recession, included a lot of things. And this was stuff all over the lot. I mean, it was from all kinds of tax incentives for consumers to buy stuff, whether it was automobiles or better windows, to investors to invest. It included mandates, which in theory were politically off the table, but we mandated the market to accept a certain amount of ethanol, to obtain a certain amount of ethanol. We did the fuel economy standards. By the way, fuel economy standard design was significantly changed. It's almost unknown to most people, but it was redesigned in the process, and we're still going to figure out how well that works, in my view. I think it's a very positive step generally. And the other is, and we did things like banish the incandescent light bulb. That isn't exactly the way it was stated, but that's essentially what was done. And of course, at the state level, we had a variety of things, including the renewable portfolio standards in another state. Now, let me just go back and reiterate. I mentioned this, and there may be other elements you would put in this mix of what drives change. But since most of energy policy making is under the theory when to drive some kind of change, either for a good environmental reason or to supply the economy or out of fairness to some sector of the population, we need to recognize that there are multiple factors that affect the capacity for policy to be successful. And there has been a great tendency, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, to say, oh, it's either the markets that do it all and everything else is a failure, the government stupidly is intervening, or it's the government and aren't we lucky we took action A in 1990 that saved America. And in most cases, both are gross overstatements. Doesn't mean the action isn't relevant, but it means if we're going to have a real impact on the future change in this country, I think we have to take that into account. Now, let me make one other large point before I open this up and get off the stage. And that is this. Most of these developments we've been talking about were unexpected. They defied the conventional wisdom of 2000. The conventional wisdom means what was broadly accepted as what was happening in America and in the world by business, by industry, by academia. There are a few outliers who predicted something. There were a lot of people who were wishing for something and supporting policies to try to get there. But much of this, those major price increases in natural gas and oil simply were not predicted. Some people said at some point that oil price will probably go up. At some point, that natural gas price will go up. But almost in both cases, companies and everybody else said, oh, my God, that price has gone up, and it seems to be staying up. We are now in a different place. You have to simply go back and look at what the OPEC cartel, and I may have the dates wrong, but around the year 2000, the OPEC cartel was, or even after that, was saying what we want to do is try to see if we can influence the world price of oil, which they sometimes are able to do, and much of the time not. And it is to say between $20 and $40 a barrel. And within a couple of years, it was 80, 90, and 100, and even for a time went well above that. This new shale gas supplies, already talked about that, and I think everybody's aware of that. And tight oil fits into this because it's essentially the application of the same processes in trying to drill for oil. The other is the decline in imports. This had been the holy grail of winning our independence and getting our soul back in America and everything else. And yet it was just got worse and worse and worse, and almost nobody was predicting you would expect a downturn. There were a lot of promises that if you'd only elect me and adopt my policy, and if only other fools would go along, why we would have that, but it wasn't expected to happen. And the same with the decline in CO2 was not expected without some major federal intervention. By the way, there were interventions. I don't want to deny that. But also, if you had asked people in 2000, if you'd asked the Bush administration when they first came into power, do you think a new nuclear power plant is going to be licensed in this country, they would have laughed you off the stage and said, no way, there hasn't been a new license issued since 1975 in this country. Of course, now there are several out there, and there's a couple plants, or one that's really advancing rapidly under construction. Now, many of these developments are usually viewed as positive. Some of us, from an environmental point of view, would say some of them have potentially very serious negative consequences in the future, but generally viewed as positive. I think it is important to recognize in this last decade, too, there are at least two major kinds of tragedies, again, generally unpredicted. One is the Macondo well, and the other is Fukushima. And I think what this tells us is, and then I would add to that the sort of political failure to be able to either internationally or domestically come to grips with a longer-term carbon policy that I personally and many other people think is necessary to meet a requirement that the globe faces. But let me suggest to you, ahead of us, the issue is going to be managing risks. It really always is, as opposed to it's black and white, don't do this or do that, that'll get you there. We really generally rule very few things totally out and very few things totally in. We have to manage them. And there are two different kinds of risks that are represented in the energy sector today. And one is, obviously, like Macondo and like Fukushima, it's where when something goes wrong, it really can have very big negative consequences, at least in a local region. We have now technologies that are able to do extreme damage as well as, many people would argue, extreme good kind of proposition, and those require very careful management. But the second kind, and that's the one that in part this conference is about, I think, and that is the cumulative impacts of what we do is growing at such a pace because of population growth, because of economic growth around the world, that what it adds up to is a very significant impact on the global commons, the oceans and the atmosphere, where we're obviously changing the chemistry and acidifying the ocean, and we think are warming the earth in the process. And so that is our climate challenge. So let me just say again in short, the energy picture changed very significantly over the last decade, in my view. Much of that change was totally unexpected. And in the face of that uncertainty, what we need to keep in the mind is how do we deal with uncertainty? Because anybody who thinks we know what's going to happen in the next decade totally is likely to get quite fooled, and yet we have to make decisions in business and personal and things like that. It seems to me the only grand strategy is keep your mind open, keep your policy open and adaptable, and keep your markets open. But we can get more specific. I can maybe, and I know the rest of the panel will be much more effective at that. But let me also suggest it's very important to keep in mind that the groundwork for this change, much of it was laid over decades of private and public investment and research and development, which many people later ascribed as a failure. And in fact, it's only because we didn't get the benefits, we didn't get the result of the change that we expected on the schedule we got. But those came into play later. They were ready when the politics and the marketplace wanted to accept them. Well, let me suggest to you, we want to keep us on climate, focused on the science, focused on technology development, and I'll make a quick pitch for we got to price that carbon. That carbon tax is still alive, including and I would vote for it, but I'm not there. It's easy to say. Thank you very much.
Okay.
How do you want us to?
Okay, thank you. And I promise never to talk about your 10-cent gas tax. It's now a 40-cent gas tax. So we have a good panel here. Adele, you're going to come up and give a little talk, right? Now you've got your presentation up there. I'll introduce the other folks. Adele is the policy director at the Brookings Climate and Energy Economics Project. And I'll just leave it at that since we have, but she's a leader in this field of economic modeling for carbon pricing. Our second, the other members of the panel are Chris Malins. Chris is a modeler for ICCT, the International Council for Clean Transportation, and his expertise is in life cycle analysis of different fossil fuel pathways and biofuels and the indirect impacts of biofuel production. David Friedman is the Deputy Director of the Clean Vehicles Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Before that, he was Director of the University of California, Davis, of the Fuel Cell Vehicle Modeling Program, which I think explains why he's been at UCS for the last 10 years, given the fuel cell problems, getting that off the ground. And our moderator will be Monica Trauzy, who is the managing editor and host of E&E TV, and as we all know, hostess of the daily interview program On Point with Monica Trousey. So that's the team. Adele, why don't you just go ahead?
Thanks, David. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you today. Can you load that up, my presentation?
You just have to press it.
Oh, I just got to. Okay, there we go. All right, that's me. I'm with the Brookings Institution. It's a pleasure to be here. I had to go at least, 20 yards from my building next door. But this is a very interesting topic to me. I've been working on energy policy and climate policy since 1997 when I was at the White House and we were negotiating the Kyoto Protocol. So it's been a while. And I'm going to give you the economist perspective on these policy issues and where oil fits in. It's very much an economist perspective, but an economist who's been steeped in the policy process for a good 14 years on these issues. So economists get in this game when we argue there's a policy case to be made when there's a failure of markets involved. Markets are going to get it wrong if left to their own devices. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of market failures. One of the most important, of course, in the energy world are external costs. When I put gas in my car, the price of that gasoline reflects the cost to explore, produce, refine, transport, and market that gasoline, but the price I pay doesn't include the damages to the environment from the combustion gases from my car. So there you have an external cost that I'm not bearing when I buy that gasoline. And when you have that difference between private cost and social cost, you have a classic case of a market failure. The damages we think of, we've been talking a lot about climate change. There are other damages that can come from energy, air pollution, water pollution. We've heard about land degradation and so on. I tried to find the most sort of disturbing picture I could of unconventional oil production there on the bottom. But there's a lot of issues involved. I'm going to focus on climate change, but it's not to disregard those other factors. Now, so when we talk about climate change, there's a whole host of greenhouse gases. This is a picture of the U.S. composition of emissions in 2010. The blue wedge is CO2. These are the other gases. So when we talk about pricing carbon, we focus on carbon because it's the lion's share of U.S. emissions. And if you don't do something about CO2, you're really not tackling the problem. And where oil fits in, so these other colored lines are emissions from different fossil energy fuels. And the biggest in terms of CO2 emissions is petroleum. That's this purple line here. Now, coal and natural gas are both very important, but you're not going to tackle CO2 emissions from the United States unless you tackle petroleum. Now, it tends to be one of the higher cost ways to reduce CO2 relative to fuels used in electricity. But you still, if you're going to decarbonize the U.S. economy, you have to deal with oil at some point. So I'm going to run through the list of when we talk about carbon tax, we haven't really talked about, well, what policy is that exactly? So I'm going to give you the economist's canonical idea of what a carbon tax would be. Okay, so it's an excise tax. It's on the carbon content of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, that you could administratively identify those emissions and identify a taxable entity that you could price their emissions. Now, it doesn't have to be on the combusted product. It can be the carbon embodied in that fuel. Most economists would suggest that this excise tax would start modestly and increase over time. And the reason is that you want capital stock to turn over in a more emissions efficient way. You don't want to prematurely scrap the entire installed capital base of the American economy. You want to do this over time, and that's the economically efficient way to do it. Of course, you have to balance that with your environmental objectives, and so there's some sweet spot there. You want the price on carbon to reflect that difference between private costs and social costs. What are those environmental damages? Monetize them as best you can and make that your price signal that you're imposing through policy. And then a lot of us just kind of stop there because that's the excise tax. But the economics of it depend very importantly on what you do with that revenue. Okay, it doesn't have to be a revenue increasing policy, and I'm going to talk in a minute about one way you could use that revenue that could be a pro-growth option. Now that's the tax part of it. Obviously that's one part of an overall climate policy portfolio that's got to involve adaptation and diplomacy and all sorts of other research and development, all sorts of other policies. But in my view, it's an absolutely necessary condition to efficiently addressing the problem. Now, when I talk about, well, the price has to reflect the social costs or those damages, it's really hard to do because the damages to the environment are uncertain. We know that. We don't have a perfect map from the X degrees centigrade to the environmental damages. And, how do you monetize, the polar bear in the wild? How do you do that? So there's a lot of ecological damages that are tough to put a value on. But look, you got to make a policy and you got to pick a price. It's not zero, it's not infinite. What should it be? The Obama administration went through quite a rigorous analysis. People disagree with the results in some cases, but somewhere I'm going to say they came out with $5 to $65 a ton. That was from a couple years ago. You're at least looking at about $10 to $80 a ton is somewhere in there of the current marginal social costs of carbon. Part of this, though, is we're trying to address these social damages. If what you want to do is help these guys here in the developing world, again, mitigation's only part of it. Maybe we should already be talking about adaptation more than we are now. So what I tell my students, it's really tough to talk about characterizing these benefits, but one way to do it is to think of buying a new probability distribution. People talk about 2 degrees, but we can't. I think it's more meaningful to talk about probability distributions than point estimates. So, what we're going to be doing if we stabilize at 550 parts per million is going from this probability, this wheel of fortune around temperature change to this wheel of fortune around temperature change. And I want to stress that this is temperature change and not damages. There can be really nasty things embedded in very small wedges. So you want a probability weight, very big numbers, and still you might be really worried about a wedge, even if it's quite small. But I think as a communication strategy, it's really important that people understand that we are trying to change the risk profile of the Earth's climate. So this tax on carbon, the point of it is not to raise revenue, although that could be a useful function. The point is to change the relative price of different sources of energy and energy in general. So natural gas has less carbon than gasoline, which has less carbon than coal per unit of energy. We want energy, we just don't want the carbon. So we want people to have the incentive to switch that out. So that makes it much more like a tax on smoking or cigarettes, because we want to discourage consumption, than a tax on income, where we actually want people to work and earn a living. So I want to argue that it makes sense to talk about a carbon tax as long as we're talking about fiscal policy more broadly. We need to raise revenue. We can use that revenue to lower other taxes, reduce the deficit. We also might be able to replace some of our less efficient regulation and subsidies with a more efficient price signal. We can use some of the revenue to protect the poor and from cuts that might otherwise occur in social safety net programs. And although some of my colleagues at Brookings might say, look, Adele, a carbon tax just makes fiscal reform all that much harder. Why do you want to lard it up with something as complicated as climate policy? But maybe it can, change the add a new dimension for the negotiations. So economists focus on efficient policy because What it means is that if you have an inefficient policy, you're paying more for the same outcome than you need to, right? The environment doesn't give us brownie points if we pay more for those emissions reductions than we otherwise might. Likewise, taxes have a cost. If I impose a toll on a bridge, I'm going to collect money from everybody who goes over the bridge, but I'm not going to collect money from the people who go all the long way around to avoid my toll. That's the excess burden of my tax system. And the idea of efficient fiscal reform is to minimize that excess burden. And the idea of efficient climate policy is to try to minimize those compliance costs and the macroeconomic effects of them. So regulations and subsidies tend to be less efficient than a price signal for a whole host of reasons. Again, you have the government potentially driving investment to one technology over another, having less information than investors themselves. Subsidies certainly are going to subsidize everybody who is going to do that anyway before they get anybody to do it who wasn't going to do it anyway. And standards can actually be quite inefficient if they make the activity cheaper. If I have a more efficient furnace, I might set my thermostat a little warmer than I otherwise might. And the same is true for a fuel-efficient car. And finally, if I have a standard, I have to make a light bulb that meets a standard. What happens if I find a more efficient technology? Maybe they'll just change the standards on me. And once I meet the standard, I don't have an incentive to go beyond it. So price signals do that better than direct regulation and subsidies. And we find that in our modeling, you'll see a few highlights from some of our research. This is looking at carbon emissions from comparing a carbon tax, which is this green line, going down. In other words, the carbon tax that's just of the flavor I just described, starting modestly going up, drives emissions down dramatically. An equivalent sized tax credit for energy efficient household capital barely budges the emissions profile. That's from our macroeconomic modeling. Now, why is that? Several things is that, again, when I buy a new item that might be subsidized, call it the tax credit for energy efficient windows, okay? Once it only applies to new capital, not the capital I already have. Whereas a price signal that makes electricity more expensive makes me use everything I already have more efficiently, okay? And also, these tax credits for energy efficient equipment don't do anything to encourage electricity generation to be more carbon efficient. So anyway, there's a whole host of reasons why a price signal offers many economic drivers that some regulations and subsidies don't. So I want to talk a little bit more about the potential for a carbon tax in a fiscal reform, because we've done some recent modeling on this. One of our questions is, if we had a U.S. carbon tax, how will it matter how those revenues are used? And if we were going to compare different ways to reduce a deficit, how does a carbon tax stack up against other policies? Now, one way to think about this is, okay, you put a tax on carbon, and the risk is you invite an economist, we have to talk about marginal something or other. So this is the marginal abatement costs, okay? So going to the right is more and more abatement. So the first amount of emissions reductions are pretty cheap. This is the cost. The vertical axis is the cost for each ton. So the first few tons could be energy efficiency. And then we're talking about fuel switching from coal to natural gas, for example. Maybe some of that is pretty cheap now. Then we're getting into renewables, and up here we're shutting down our economy. So we're going to start with the cheapest abatement first, and then work our way up until we get to the point where we're hitting our environmental goal. So if we had a tax, let's say this is our tax, then we're going to abate emissions down to the point where it's cheaper to pay the tax. And then the tax revenue is this rectangle right there. It's how many remaining emissions we have times the price for each ton of emissions, right? So the amount I'm actually going to spend to abate is this area under the red curve, and the amount I'm collecting in tax revenue is the rectangle. Now, this is more the actual geometry of what we were talking about in the scale of emissions reduction, say in the Waxman-Markey, at least in the early years. So the abatement costs are very small relative to that tax revenue that you would get if you had a modest price on carbon. And that tax revenue is really a transfer. People think about taxes as costs, but the money doesn't leave the economy. It goes somewhere. So it's a transfer from people who pay the carbon price through higher prices to people who get the revenue through government spending. Okay, so when you're thinking about what kind of carbon tax revenue you could get, it's really important whether or not you include petroleum. This is a study we did where we compared two different scenarios with the same emissions reductions. This is revenue when we only tax fuels going into electricity. The orange is revenue from coal and the green is revenue from gas. This lower bar is when we looked at taxing all fuels across the economy, including oil. And the blue is the revenue from petroleum for the same emissions reductions. So if you tax petroleum, even to get the same emissions reductions economy-wide, you get a lot more revenue. Now, why is that? That's because the responsiveness in oil consumption is a lot less elastic. People want to drive. There's not as many substitutes for driving as there are for electricity fuels. You can switch from coal to natural gas. So if your issue is revenue, it's important to think about including petroleum. So back to the other study. So now I'm going to go through a carbon tax scenario. We modeled $15 a ton starting now, rising at 4% over inflation. And we looked at different ways to use the revenue. This is only looking at carbon in energy, fossil energy, okay? And it's coal, oil, and gas. What kind of revenues did we estimate? We would, in our estimates, you'd start with at least $80 billion a year. And that would increase over time up to about $170 billion within about 20 years. So that's a substantial amount of revenue that could be used either to reduce the deficit or for reducing other taxes. Accordingly, emissions decline in our analysis. By mid-century, we'd be, just with that very modest carbon tax, rising very modestly, we'd get 34% below our baseline emissions level by mid-century. Now, what would be the economic effects of such a tax? Well, like I alluded earlier, it depends a lot on what you use that revenue for. And we did several scenarios, but this is GDP relative to baseline. And this is a model where we use those revenues to reduce tax rates on capital income. That means corporate income and other kinds of dividends and investments. Basically, what you're doing is returning that money to enhance the returns to capital investment. And what we find is that could be a pro-growth approach. And why would that be? This is a graph of the corporate statutory tax rates and how they are distributed across countries in the OECD. In 1981, the U.S., this is the red bar, we were about in the middle of developed economies of corporate tax rates. Now, we are at the high end, an outlier in statutory tax rates. Now, again, there are a lot of corporate tax rates, and the effective tax rates can be a little different than the statutory tax rates. But one thing that many economists propose is that we need to reform our corporate income tax structure to make the U.S. economy more attractive for investment. And that's one of the things that drives the pro-growth results. Now, it's not a huge effect. The vertical axis here is just 0.2%. of GDP, so it's not big. But what I can say is there's good evidence now that a carbon tax doesn't have to be a job-killing energy tax that's the demise of American manufacturing or any of that sort. We can do it in a way that's economically very responsible. Now, this is a deliberately dorky slide. This is a potato, and it's to remind us that a carbon price is a hot potato. And it's the statutory incidence of that tax is not the economic incidence. It will get passed down to households and consumers. And we have to be mindful of the effect on poor households. Nobody's gonna pay that tax if they can pass it along. And we do have good evidence. This is from a recent paper by Aparna Mather and I, showing that now, not looking at the effect net of other tax changes, but just at the carbon price itself, proportionately, the tax is going to hit the lowest income households the most as a share of their income. Not just through direct energy prices, but through indirect effects on the prices of other goods and services they consume. So everybody pays some of the carbon price, but as a share of income, the poorest end up paying more, and that's a concern, so we have to do something about that. So just to conclude, we have this dialogue around fiscal policy. We have a climate exigency. There really is a deal to be made, and I want to argue that we shouldn't let a fiscal crisis go to waste, and use this as an opportunity to have responsible conversations, both about fiscal policy and about what to do about climate change. And I really do think that, okay, we're economists, we don't often get elected to anything, but I do think that it's our job to offer responsible solutions, and I think this is one way to do it. So I'll stop there.
Based on the current political climate here in Washington, what is the likelihood that Congress will actually engage on a carbon tax, and what level of understanding do you believe there is among members of Congress on these details of a carbon tax?
So I'll take that really briefly, but I want to be sure I leave time for my other two colleagues to offer their remarks. But just really quickly, and I would love to come back to this question. I think that okay, lower it. Okay, is that better? I think that the folks on the Hill who were very involved in the cap and trade debate, the environment committees and so on, it's taking them a while to sort of mourn that process and work through the stages of grief of that, and to sort of think of what next, and what does that look like, and could they be for a carbon tax, and thinking through that. I think it's going to take some work to get the carbon tax in the fiscal dialogue, and I think that's the challenge now. That's the conversation that everybody's fixated on. So far, nobody's wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole, but I sort of view the job of the propeller heads in town to kind of keep that idea on the table. And that maybe, it can be immaculately conceived in some big, broader fiscal deal.
I would.
Sure, yeah.
There we go. 5 minutes down from 15, life is pain. Okay, well, I was going to go quickly anyway. Of course, obligatory thanks to Debbie and Carnegie for putting this on, and for all of the great speakers we've heard today. I was going to try and sort of drag us back. I've been trying to come up with a good tar baby metaphor. I'm not quite there yet, but suggestions in the tin at the back at the end, anyone who likes Brer Rabbit. But the context that we've heard about today is of expanding unconventional oil production, and of unconventional oil production which seems likely to continue to expand to 2030 to 2050, with a couple of caveats about where the investment climate might go, about the point at which that starts to seem incompatible with our climate goals. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers expect to see oil sands production up to about 5 million barrels a day by 2030. EIA, I think, in the high oil price scenario from last year, have tight oil going up to about 1.5 million barrels a day, something like that. In the same time, and of course, all around the edges, we have these very large kerogen resources and coal, and people like the South Africans have been turning coal into oil for a little while, and that's something which always seems like maybe a possibility, not necessarily so much in the US, but in some parts of the world. So with these resources starting to impinge on conventional oil, the question that we explored in the morning, and if the technical panel will do policy, I don't see why I shouldn't briefly revisit a little bit of technical detail. The question is, of course, what does this mean for the carbon? And as we heard from Adam and Debbie and others, some of these resources are going to be really quite high carbon intensity once you move to the full life cycle, rather than looking just at the combustion of the fuels that you're making. So for oil sands, you might be looking at 20% more emissions for your diesel or your gasoline by the time it gets to the car. Of course, you know, before you've decided what sort of car to put it in, or how to drive it, or where to drive it, or anything of this sort. And so this becomes significant. It's not the single biggest part of the climate change puzzle, but it's an important element. If you're looking at 5% of fuel with a 20% increase in emissions, that's sort of raising the carbon footprint of global oil by 1%. And I mean, that's a lot of carbon dioxide. So the question, of course, becomes, do we try to control that? How do we try to control that? How do we deal with making this difference? How does, for instance, a carbon tax deal with these slightly complex life cycle analysis questions? In some ways, it can be easier to deal with sort of point emission sources than anyone who's been involved in biofuels will have a sort of an understanding that these questions can become quite complicated once you start trying to deal with things at the well-to-wheel level. And something to point out is that we're not just talking about unconventional oil here either. There's various production pathways that you might characterize as conventional, thermally enhanced production, the sort of Californian model, I understand. Things like doing upgrading of extra heavy oil in Venezuela. We've done some analysis with OpG. You can get out to the North Sea, and when you look at the amount of reported water production for some of these oil fields, you're actually starting to look at really relatively high emissions as fields start to grow older, water out, simply by virtue of lifting all of that water. And we have to be aware of the different size of the resources. The oil sands are huge, the oil shales are huge. There's a natural limit on how many oil wells are petering out at any given time. The point being that we now have, in a way that we didn't used to, the life cycle analysis tools that enable us to distinguish between these pathways, whether that's Adam's OpG, whether it's work by consultants like Jacobs have been doing work for the government of Alberta, and we had a report with Energy Redefined, a few copies of which were floating around earlier, demonstrating that when you look at the full sort of well-to-tank life cycle of these fuels, you can go from all right, so I'll throw in some numbers just for good measure. So for anyone who isn't used to this language, burning or producing a megajoule of energy by burning petrol or diesel is round about 73 grams of carbon dioxide per megajoule. So this is the sort of scale. 73 is the carbon dioxide from burning it. So at the low end, producing it is adding about 5 to that. You know, not such a big increase, important to be aware of, not such a big difference. As you get to some of the very high flaring fields, some of the watered out fields, the upgraders, you can get sort of 20, 30, 40, even more grams per megajoule. So you're adding another half beyond burning the fuel in terms of the impact that you're having on the climate. So at that end, that changes quite profoundly your sort of understanding of how climate problematic using your transport fuel is. At the downstream end, at the refinery, we haven't talked too much about refineries today, but you know, Debbie certainly got us started thinking about this. There's a difference. These light sweet oils, relatively easy to process. if I pick some numbers out of work by Jacobs, you're sort of going from 4 grams at the easy end of refining up to 15 grams at the sort of for the extra heavy oils, the bitumens, when you have these very heavy fuels, and you're doing an awful lot of work, high conversion refining, to produce high value products such as transport fuels. So we have all of this context. We have a lot of public concern now. We haven't talked about that too much today, coming, as some of you may have been able to gather, from England. There's quite a lively sort of European public concern about oil sands and the carbon intensity of fuel. You know, the same is reflected, of course, in America with Keystone, these various other campaigns. And the regulations that I'm going to talk about quickly adds something which is actually sort of being put in place already as a regulatory tool, as a policy tool, to start addressing these unconventional oil and other oil emissions, what you might think of as low carbon fuel standards, plural, with the low carbon fuel standard in California as the sort of the archetype and the original, and if Dan Sperling is still here, the best. So, and these policies were in fact put in place with a focus on alternative fuels in the first instance. So what you have is regulators starting to introduce policy frameworks, essentially to start monetizing the carbon, or monetizing the carbon savings delivered by different alternative fuels, give a sort of a performance-based framework. So if you look at California, you might have the corn ethanol default carbon intensities offer a relatively modest carbon saving or no carbon saving at all. And then as you move towards sugarcane ethanol or to your cellulosic ethanol, you know, when it happens, you start to deliver much higher savings. So the sort of natural question as you're starting to implement these programs in California, in Europe, up in British Columbia as well, is given that we're starting to monetize the carbon in biofuels, why don't we also start to monetize the carbon in fossil fuels? And can we use these programs as a vehicle to start sending some of this price signal that we've been talking about all day? So Adele talked about carbon taxes. Obviously, you know, this is one way of doing it. But by, and this is sort of the direction that we've been heading in California, in Europe, you could think about coupling the carbon in oils, carbon in tar sands, or in, I mean, if you look at the Californian example, as Adam introduced, looking at, I can't remember how many different crude oils they've modeled, but yeah, it's dozens. It's a lot of different sources, a lot of different pathways. And you can start to distinguish. The point is, of course, that through price you start to influence investment decisions, you start to give incentives for people to actually improve practice. In the middle session, we were talking a little bit about Alberta and the fact that, you know, while oil sands extraction remains very carbon intensive, there has been a sort of a serious and genuine effort to deliver efficiencies. And there's a sense within Canada that they need to be seen to be delivering efficiencies. And that has been, you know, that's not necessarily coming out of the low carbon fuel standard, but these are various policies that are going to have the same type of effect. So you sort of change the investment signal in terms of which projects you move ahead with, you change the investment signal in terms of the way that you focus on energy efficiency. So this is now up and running in California as of this year, at a reporting level, I should say. So they're going to be asking all of those people supplying oil into California, identify the crude that they're supplying, identify the carbon intensity of that crude from their lookup tables, provide an opportunity to provide more data. If you don't like your carbon intensity, if you think it's too high, report, improve, demonstrate better performance. And so you start to build the framework to have a handle on this and start to have a more sort of sophisticated trajectory towards increasingly going beyond just a reporting signal. And actually, in principle, you can develop that into a price signal. And in Europe, the proposal that has been in the table is to distinguish conventional crude from tar sands crude, from kerogen, this oil shale, higher carbon intensities again, coal to liquids technologies, higher carbon intensities again. So a proposal that you would split those, divide up those baskets. Now, I mean, what Adele just showed us was sort of, you had a slide that sort of said, natural gas, oil, coal. So that's sort of one level of disaggregating the carbon intensity of energy. The European Commission's talking about going a little further, disaggregating within petroleum. California going further still than that. So I'll try and close up quickly. I don't know quite how much I bust through my 5 minutes. We have these frameworks which are coming in place. We have analytical frameworks which are so much more sophisticated than they were, 5 or 10 years ago. We're in a much better place analytically to understand the carbon implications of extracting and refining these fuels. And these are the tools that you need if you're going to put in place policy, which is going to start changing investment decisions. There's also, I think, significant opportunities for what the Europeans refer to as upstream emission reductions. So can you find the low-hanging fruit, something like reducing flaring? If you look at various jurisdictions, look at the Norwegians, they don't allow flaring in the North Sea effectively. So, I mean, the North Sea has a lot of gas infrastructure compared to North Dakota. But you can start putting in place either through the Clean Development Mechanism, which, of course, has been in place for some time and does provide some support to flaring reduction projects. But you can imagine putting in place more incentives for sort of well-understood opportunities to reduce emissions, whether that's in unconventional oil like the North Dakota tight oil, or whether that's for conventional oil out in Cameroon or Nigeria or Uzbekistan, or wherever it is. And I would say that the thing that the International Council on Clean Transportation does, as sort of modus operandi, is to take a good regulation and spread it around a bit. So once things start to be implemented in California or in Europe, then once you have examples of these implemented working policies, reporting frameworks that work and that have been demonstrated, then you can start taking this out to the rest of the world, and I think you can start making some progress. So it's important. I will close off by saying, we mentioned earlier, I think Adam mentioned shuffling. There's always a concern with one of these policies in one jurisdiction that you can see, that you will have leakage, that you can push the problem down the road. But as Mark was saying, in the middle of the day, if we're going to hit our 2-degree target, or a 4-degree target for that matter, then you're going to need some regulatory frameworks. I think this is the direction of travel, and I think it's okay to be the people who are setting that example.
Well, thanks, Debbie, David, and Jessica, and all the sponsors for the chance to talk about unconventional oil. And part of what I want to do, you heard some perspectives both in the previous panel and in this panel, kind of on looking at the economic side, the carbon price side. And Adele talked about this from the perspective of an economist. I want to talk about this from the perspective of an engineer and a policy wonk. So my apologies ahead of time. And where I want to start, actually, is with one of my favorite engineers and policy wonks, which is Debbie Gordon, because one of the things she says about unconventional oil, which I think is really right on, is that we need new rules for new fuels because of this new boom. And so, as quickly as I can, what I want to do is, first, if we need new rules for new fuels, the first thing we've got to do is define the game. What's the game we're playing here? What's at stake? What are the choices we're trying to make? And then the second question we have to ask is, what's the playing field? What are we walking into here in terms of the playing field that we're facing that I'll oversimplify and say that two opponents are playing? And who are those opponents? Because basically, you can argue that the ability to export oil and petroleum products could mitigate this competition some. Some will argue that you can do that. But fundamentally, we're talking about the competition, a choice between a vision of aggressively pursuing an unconventional oil boom that's going to bring with it massive impacts on the climate, on public health, in communities, industrializing neighborhoods, and it's happening. The train's moving. It's leaving the station. That vision, that future, is competing directly with another vision where we could cut oil use in half over the next 20 years. And by relying on things like efficiency and direct substitutes for oil. That's really the game that we're playing right now. And I don't think we should kid ourselves that that's not what's at stake. And we in America are going to be making a decision on which path are we going to spend most of our time moving aggressively down. Because while they could both move forward in parallel, the industry is trying to push forward that oil boom is also trying to push forward the perspective that a lot of those other solutions are political boondoggles. So they're in it for blood, they're in it for a lot of profit. And so now the next question is, if we understand the game, if we understand what's at stake, an oil boom versus a progress boom, and I should say a progress boom that's already starting to happen. Electric vehicles, the sales of which tripled last year. Biofuels, cellulosic biofuels, which have had a hard time, everyone admits, getting started. Well, in Florida, we've got the first small commercial-scale cellulosic biofuel plant that's operating. More cellulosic biofuel plants are set to come online within the next few years. At the same time, we're going to be nearly doubling fuel economy of cars and cutting their greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2025. And just last year, we saw the continuation of a trend, a generational trend, where the younger generation is defining themselves more by their cell phones than by their cars, and are therefore not choosing to drive as often, or aren't even choosing to own cars at all. So there's real progress going on in a pathway where if you combine efficiency and alternatives to oil, we really could cut oil use in half. It's moving, but the real problem is that the playing field is anything but level. In fact, it's overwhelmingly stacked in favor of moving ahead with that oil boom like a freight train. And there's a lot of different ways in which the deck is stacked, and those provide a lot of different clues as to different ways that we can address the policies. As we saw earlier, there are a lot of costs, externalities effectively, that the oil industry doesn't have to consider when they're moving forward with this oil boom. And climate being the top of those. So if you ignore those costs, obviously the outcome is almost predetermined. Now, from the perspective of an engineer, I really care about efficiency, and I think carbon prices are incredibly important. We need carbon prices. But at the same time, we also have to look at, while I'm not as pessimistic as folks on the previous panel, in fact, I'm relatively optimistic, we need to look at the urgency of the problem. We need to look not just at the economic efficiency, but at the effectiveness of policies and how quickly they can cut carbon emissions. And what that means is we've got to put the pedal to the metal to try to get a carbon price, but we also need to be pursuing effective complementary policies that can start addressing the problem right away. And part of that's because a carbon price can work really well once we've got it, but markets work, prices work, but the problem is they don't always work fast enough. And the bigger problem is consumers don't always have easy access to substitutes so that they can respond to those carbon prices. And they can't respond as quickly as we need them to respond to those prices. That's why we need these complementary policies. That's why we would need to go, in addition to a carbon price, we'd need to go even farther. A big part of what that means is the EPA moving forward with existing authority to address carbon everywhere it can along the oil production, refining, and use chain. It means putting pressure on the Obama administration to do what it already knows it needs to do. I mean, it's already moved forward with carbon standards for cars. It's moved forward with some initial carbon standards for trucks. Now it needs to aggressively move forward with carbon standards for refineries, with carbon standards, if possible, even for extraction, with carbon standards for planes, trains, ships, businesses, boilers that are used in businesses and homes that use oil to help people heat their homes or get the processes working in their factories. So we need a carbon price, but if we don't move forward with these complementary policies that we already have the authority to address, my concern is we're going to look back and say carbon price is the right policy, but it took us too long to get to a price that's high enough to deal with the magnitude of the problem we've got. In fact, there's also real benefits to moving forward with both the carbon price and these complementary policies. A few years ago, we did a study looking at the potential for climate mitigation out to 2030, and we looked at both a carbon price, in this case through a cap, and these complementary policies. And what we found is that not only can you achieve net savings from controlling carbon, that those net savings over 20 years can be about $1 trillion higher when you match that carbon price with those complementary policies. Why? Because those complementary policies accelerate the options for consumers to respond to those prices. They accelerate the options for consumers to save billions of dollars on gasoline at the pump. So we've got to match these policies together if we're going to retilt the playing field to a place where things can work better. And it's not just about carbon. A lot of people are blown away when they find out that oil production and fracking are exempt from important portions of a lot of the most important environmental and health protections in the United States. Whether it's the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, parts of the Clean Air Act, other more less well-known policies that regulate how you deal with waste and toxic waste and carcinogens and hazardous waste. People who are refining unconventional oils can pretty much just ignore these problems until the problems actually happen and they get sued. That dramatically tilts the economics in the situation, and the carbon price can't capture those. Now, in some cases, it's going to require congressional action to close those loopholes. But even here, we're seeing the administration at least trying to move forward where they can. For example, at refineries, putting limits on flaring based on the dangerous emissions that come from flaring. Or we're seeing EPA starting to move forward finally with studies to really understand what the water quality and the drinking water impacts are associated with fracking. Now, I am not the expert on this stuff. A lot of these experts are actually in the audience, so hopefully in the Q&A we can get into those a little bit more. But both on carbon and on public health, community health, and safety, the playing field is radically tilted. The one other place where the playing field is radically tilted is when it comes to financial supports for industries. Now, I'm probably going to get tomatoes thrown at me for this, but subsidies aren't an inherently bad thing. Subsidies can actually do really good things. The problem is when subsidies outlive their usefulness. The problem is when subsidies, which are designed to help the underdog that has a really promising future to deliver benefits to society, once they become a mature industry, I don't know, like the oil industry, they continue to get those subsidies. I mean, there are estimates, depending on how long of a fight you want to have over the definition of a subsidy, that those subsidies are anywhere from a few $1 billion a year to hundreds of billions of dollars a year. These are subsidies that have been going on for almost 100 years. And conservative estimates put the cumulative numbers for oil and gas at hundreds of billions of dollars over that time. Orders of magnitude, in some cases, higher than what the alternatives have gotten. So the deck is stacked, and another way we need to level the playing field is getting rid of the oil subsidies, but not throwing subsidies out with the bathwater, making sure that those subsidies and government support is around to help the underdogs that can deliver that half the oil future. Very quickly, two more points. One is the other place that the deck is stacked is the public conversation. And I was really glad to hear a lot of people here today say, frankly, the concept that we're going towards oil independence or energy independence is two words that I shouldn't say in public, but one is a B and one is an S. That's not the future we're headed towards. This oil boom will not make us independent. As long as we're tied to oil, which is traded on a world oil market, we're still going to be facing volatility, national security issues, and a lot of the other issues we've been dealing with for a while. Will they be less? Will they be mitigated? Sure. But we could mitigate them a lot more by simply using a lot less. Finally, let me just close. I think there's been a lot of desire to talk about, hey, what's the simple policy? What's that one silver bullet that can get us where we need to go? And I'm very sympathetic. I really wish we could get there, but I think we have to be honest. Policy is ugly. Policy is complicated. And with problems these big, with this big, with this many moving parts, we're going to need a lot of different policy approaches at a lot of different levels, including pricing, in order to get a handle on the impacts that oil creates, especially unconventional oil, and to level the playing field between a vision of dramatic growth in oil production and use versus a vision of cutting oil use in half over 20 years. Thank you.
About the carbon tax, because I just wanted to reinforce something that Adele said, and this is not a challenge to what was said here about other kind of policies, but the opportunity is now about a carbon tax, and that should not be lost on activists and others. Yep. There are no guarantees. If this were a slam dunk, I mean, things would be easy. But nobody should misunderstand that there is an opportunity here. One, because the Congress has gotten itself through a variety of means where it must make some decisions about the deficit, and in theory want to make decisions about tax reform. The two issues are nested together because a lot of people believe we cannot get ourselves economically in a better footing if we don't engage in serious tax reform. Whether you believe it or not, that's a very widespread opinion these days. And so there is going to be action, as we've already seen a piece of the action occur. Now, nobody is out front, as Adele says, and nobody should bet their savings on this Congress being able to do anything. But actually, I do believe it will do things, but it might. And the reason is, this is not to adopt a carbon policy. That will not be what drives the possibility here. It is because when you try to solve the deficit problem, or you try to get serious tax reform, all these simplistic formulas don't add up politically. Maybe you can make them mathematically add up, but they sure as heck don't add up in anybody's view of American politics today, and so you need another stream of revenue. And all the revenue choices are ugly, and nobody wants any of them. And the only reason somebody might vote for any of these revenue choices, including a carbon tax, is because they want something else that they need to get. Like if you want serious corporate tax reform, you're not going to get rid of all the deductions in order to achieve it. So what are you going to do? And so I'm not here to preach the gospel that this is where it is, but I would say don't lose this opportunity to be open-minded. Our organization does not engage in advocacy, but we are working with Adele. We're working with other people to do analysis of the various options and designs and all those kind of questions, so it's available. And by the way, there are congressional staff on Capitol Hill that are working on this. There are people in the executive branch working on this. There are people in a number of major industries in this country working on it. And at the moment, it's not clear there's a strong advocacy for it, but it is because a lot of people don't believe that it's just ruled totally off the table.
David, I wanted to reference something that you said. Clearly, this train is moving very quickly. How prepared do you think the government, the State Department, the other agencies that will be in charge of regulation, how prepared are they for the challenges and opportunities that are being presented by unconventional oil when it comes to regulating these sources?
I mean, there's a lot of really impressive and really smart folks in government, and I think they're working hard to come up to speed. But, I mean, there was a reason why we needed this panel. And there's a reason why we need a lot more of these panels, is because this has moved faster than most people expected. It has much bigger implications than I think a lot of us expected. The good news, though, is there's a lot of infrastructure out there to do this, whether it's on the science side with some of the work that Chris and Adam and others are doing to get a handle on the numbers, or on the precedents that this administration has already been setting in the need to price carbon, in the need to regulate carbon emissions. So I think we're walking. We need to be running, but we're walking, and we're walking in the right direction. And I think that's a lot better than a lot of people would have expected. I'm hoping that events like this can convince policymakers and advocates and companies that we do need to start running, because the train's moving and we got to catch up with it.
There's so much criticism relating to transparency in this field. What are the opportunities for transparency and corporate responsibility? This is for any of the panelists.
Well, California, the sort of Air Resources Board has handed the oil industry an excellent opportunity for transparency, some sense, by inviting them to actually sort of participate and demonstrate performance. Now, if you go out scouring the literature for parameters for oil fields, as I have, sadly, you'll find that there are bits and pieces around. There's some places where there's actually relatively comprehensive reporting, as I think Adam mentioned this morning. You go to Canada, you go to California, you go to the UK or Denmark, or surprisingly to me, the Nigerians actually are quite good on production and flaring reporting and these sorts of things. So there's information out there, but there is also within the oil industry a very strong culture of proprietary information. And I think, obviously, business has a need for its information. It is completely appropriate that some of this does, play to people's advantage and part of their business plans and so on and so forth. But, of course, what you see is that a lot of the information that you need to start getting a more detailed understanding of some of these processes, people are sort of leaking out here and there around the edges while they're talking about other things. So, I think, number one, we need to understand a balance. Where is there really a commercial problem in disclosing information? A tool, something like OPGI, an engineering-based assessment of the carbon intensity of oil production, needs sort of some relatively simple parameters that you can find sort of sloshing around in the Society of Petroleum Engineers and these sorts of places. And I think there's an opportunity to work with industry to be a little bit more constructive about, identifying really where is there commercial value and where actually would it be better for all concerned to have a bit more transparency. But it's always difficult, especially with a new technology. And if you look at the history, such as it is, of life cycle analysis in oil production, you have 150 years of oil, and only within the last decade or two, you're starting to see people distinguishing different pathways and really putting carbon values on these things. Now, with oil sands, it's taken, when were the first oil sands projects in Canada? The 70s, I guess. So you're sort of running 40 years, and we've got a pretty good picture, relatively sophisticated analyses now. We have tight oil, and I haven't seen an analysis yet on tight oil. So there is a challenge for regulators and industry and the sort of consultancy community and academic community to work together, because you can't price the carbon in tight oil until you've worked out what it actually is.
Well, another important example of the transparency issue is the issue of the chemicals that are used in fracking. That's a really hot and live issue. And, even if we were willing to trust but verify, because of the exemptions in the law, we can't even verify. So, it's a huge problem, and I think one of the interesting things, you mentioned corporate responsibility, is the lawsuit risk here on a lot of these issues is, I think, a real thing that these companies need to deal with. There's two solutions if you get lawsuits over the impacts of some of this stuff. One solution is to go to Congress and try to get immunity. We saw that with MTBE and things like that, so that's a real risk. And another way is to include it, to talk about what you're doing, to disclose within the company what you're doing, and to work with the government to manage it. We've got to break through that resistance, because it's going to hurt companies at the end of the day as much as it's going to, well, not as much, but it's going to hurt companies as well as hurting people.
Yeah, I think the reality is that unless the government, and I would hope it for legitimate and good purposes, is requiring transparency, you're not likely to get it. There's quite a variation on the natural gas fracking thing. There are whole groups of people that now are voluntarily disclosing their fracking fluids because they see it now in their interest to do so. And they see it in their interest to do so, in my view, in part because they're under the threat of being able to go into places and do their work and whatnot, and some of them I'm sure are quite sincere about making this. But to get it universal in a highly competitive industry is very difficult. I mean, obviously we saw this with the Macondo well in terms of the ability to set up something like what we call IMPO in the nuclear system, where there is a coordination of information among, as there are in nuclear plants, which goes against the grain of any competitive industry, but it's possible. So I think the moment is now for trying to be clear about what would be useful information and trying to press forward with it, because I think there are at least some folks in the industry that are quite intent, because they recognize that, as they call it, their license to operate, that means their acceptability in the society, is at stake. And so they have a self-interest in trying to make this clear. Transparency won't solve all the problems, though. I mean, good Lord, look at the U.S. government.
This is a global competition on unconventional oil. With Washington moving as slowly as it tends to, does the U.S. risk potentially falling behind the curve and losing out on a chunk of the market that it could own, essentially?
Well, that's the reverse on the production side. In other words, I mean, the problem, I don't see that Washington is holding up production, except on public lands. That's and that, I guess I don't think that's a problem.
But if we're talking, let's say we're talking about exporting energy, if the policy and regulation is not set in that case, then do we lose a piece of the market?
I personally have forgotten what is still required on an exporting of oil. Years ago, in the 1970s, we had it. We had a ban on export of oil from Alaska. When we repealed that, it was without a burp in the political system whatsoever. But I understand there are some limits still in which you must go in and get permissions to do this. Of course, there is on natural gas. We know that.
Right.
Big national interest requirement.
Yeah.
Permit.
Yeah, no, and there are limits. And I mean, I understand the point of your question, but I guess the other side of the question is, when it comes to a lot of the alternatives, are we missing out there? I mean, are we moving quickly enough there? I mean, there's a lot of claims about all the jobs that you could create in the oil industry and from this boom, and I'm sure there are jobs there, but how transient are those jobs? And at least when you look at the current oil industry, you can create a lot more jobs by putting $1 into almost anything in the economy other than oil. So there's a big question, are we missing out on opportunities on battery technology? I mean, look at what just happened with A123 Systems. A Chinese company was very happy to buy up A123's intellectual capital because they see some real benefits in it. So I'm not worried about private companies working really hard to maximize their benefits from an oil boom. I'm much more worried about the smaller underdogs who don't have the capital and resources to move forward with these alternatives and take advantage of the world energy market for biofuel, the right biofuels, for electric vehicles, for efficiency technology, things like that.
Are there questions in the audience for the panelists? Yes.
Hi, it's Robbie Diamond from Securing America's Future Energy. So I have two hopefully quick thoughts. One is, are we missing some of the point when we say it's Unconventional Oil Symposium? We spent a lot of time, the beauty about oil is that there has been bipartisan support in the past. And last I've looked, major energy and environmental legislation has usually required some Republican support. Fuel economy standards under President Bush, Nixon and the Clean Air Act, many things when it was all Democrats, we didn't get it done. And oil allows you to have this national security debate because the other side tends to buy into that. And, earlier we said if all this unconventional oil comes online, we really have a big problem. And the way to deal with it from the earlier panelists was about price and about, and it matters on price. And these are the marginal barrels. So if you bring down the price just enough, they're not going to produce it. And so it's really a demand side problem. Now, we've been saying foreign oil all this time, as David said up there. And really, we have to really work hard to redefine this problem and really make this about that question of demand. Because otherwise, demand from a security and economic perspective. Because otherwise, you get into this trap of falling foreign oil, as well as not having the other side engaged in a debate that they've past been engaged in, and I think that's an important thing. The other one is this question of carbon tax, which I think is a question of should people think about a gas tax, which is difficult. But at the same time, the carbon tax doesn't have any viability on the other side because they, at the moment, don't buy into the premise. And I think that one should see maybe gas tax as a gateway drug to other types of taxes. And at least you're fighting a battle where the other side says, hey, I actually think this is a problem. This is a solution to a problem I really believe in. And so, I guess my question there is, yes, they're parallel. I mean, the other problem with a carbon tax, which we've talked about the whole time, is say you have a $20 carbon tax, it's only 18 cents per gallon. Because really it's dealing with the more carbon-intensive fuels. So if you want to solve the oil problem in the Unconventional Oil Symposium, I would argue to say that, yes, a parallel effort or an effort is one, and a politically viable effort, just as difficult, but at least there's a reason on the other side to engage. So I would throw that out there as a proposition. Thanks.
Should I comment on that? So I go back to what exactly is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the market failure? So we have a clear market failure on carbon and climate. And on the energy security side, I would ask equal discipline in exactly what is the problem you're trying to solve. Is it macroeconomic vulnerability from volatile prices? Is it transfers to unfriendly regimes? What exactly are you worried about? And then the policy should follow exactly from the market failure you've clearly identified. So let's go to gas tax and climate for 1 second. So as I alluded to earlier, oil is one of the more costly sources of CO2 to reduce. So if you want to get the most bang for your buck in terms of climate benefits per social resource expended, you don't want to do it in oil. You're going to want to do it in electricity where you have substitutes. I'm not saying you shouldn't price carbon in oil, but I'm saying you're going to get more bang for your buck. So putting a tax on gas and then leaving carbon in electricity on price, to me, makes no sense. So yeah, maybe it's a gateway drug or whatever, but it's not an economically sensible one. So if what you're trying...
You have a cartel on the other side, though. I mean, it's the biggest market failure.
No, but my point is, what is the market failure? If it's carbon and climate, then I'm just telling you as an economist, to get the most possible emissions reductions from the cost you're incurring to society, it makes no sense to exclude fuels used in electricity. Okay, that's, I think, a well-established empirical fact. Now, there might be political impediments or some other market failures you want to talk about on the oil side, but confining yourselves to the climate question and where do you get those lowest marginal abatement costs, you don't want to exclude coal and natural gas.
I just want to quickly add, I totally agree you don't want to exclude coal and natural gas, no doubt about that. But the difference in coming at this from economist versus engineer is when I look at the numbers, cutting oil use is one of the most cost-effective ways to cut carbon emissions. And what this comes down to, which is a debate we shouldn't have now, is how do you define benefits and whether or not saving $8,000 over the life of a car, is that a benefit or not? And that's much too arcane for this conversation. But from my perspective, and I think from the administration's perspective, and I think from the general public's perspective, is that saving $8,000 is a really big deal through efficiency. And you can say, in general, per carbon, you can deliver carbon savings at a net savings by cutting oil use through things like efficiency.
Another question from the audience? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Dan Gotti. I'm the program director for Environment America's Get Off Oil program, and this is a good follow-up to Robbie's question. And I just wanted to ask Adele. So it seems to me that one of the market failures we're talking about is the externalized cost of carbon. Another market failure is the fact that 94% of all transportation in this country is powered by oil, and that's what gives rise to what you're saying is the low elasticity of oil consumption, right? That oil, because there aren't a lot of readily available alternatives, is fairly inelastic. So, and I think one of the ways that we need to be thinking about this problem is not just increasing the price to really get that last bit of carbon out of the system, but also thinking about how can we increase the elasticity of oil. And I think that conversation puts us right into how do we create more alternatives. I think it puts us into the conversation about infrastructure, which is a word that hasn't been used much today, but when it comes to why are we so dependent on oil? Well, it's because they have a huge distribution network, and natural gas or hydrogen or electric vehicles don't have the same scale. So I think it puts us in that conversation about infrastructure investment. It puts us in the conversation, I think, about more industrial policy kind of directions. And I think then politically, what Robbie was trying to say is that moving forward in this area where there is consensus that oil does do harm to not just our environment but also our economy and geopolitically, has a political rationale in addition to I think that kind of market rationale. So anyway, I'm interested to hear your response to that.
This raises what has been always a conundrum in energy policy making, and that is we have at least two goals, and there are more goals that are set by different factions, whether it's on Capitol Hill or among the American politics or in business, the community, as to what they want to accomplish with energy policy, and that's one of the reasons it always turns out to be a whole hodgepodge of things, and there is rarely one thing to do that will solve all these problems. And so we end up getting into what is the rhetorical debate versus what is the reality of policy that shapes it. I would suggest to you that one of the practical problems that Robbie is going to face in his strong advocacy is our success. Trying to turn up the American population to take more action on imports when imports are declining, given all the other things in life that we might spend our time on, is not likely to get the attention unless we have another diminishment of the world market in some way or another explosive political situation, which at some point we probably will have.
Well, and that gets back to the problem with the frame. People are used to thinking of this as an energy independence frame, and they don't get it. I mean, you saw it with the IEA report, where people took the fact that the U.S. was going to become, at least temporarily, the top world producer, and then a little while later was going to be a net exporter, and then translated that to say, therefore we will be energy independent. When the IEA report very explicitly said, there is a global market from oil, and this production will not get us out of a global market for oil. The only way you're going to do that would be by building some huge walls around this country. Maybe that would help with sea level rise, but I don't think it's going to happen.
We tried to build a price wall with price controls in 1975, and it was, believe me, a good economic disaster for the country that diminished our ability to actually have better.
Well, I want to emphasize this point, is there's a big difference between self-sufficiency and economic independence. And people in the whole energy security discussion, this is just miserably conflated. And so when we're getting ready to talk about policies, again, I want to emphasize, be extraordinarily specific about what problem are you trying to solve. The mere existence of petroleum-based liquid fuels is not a market failure. It's either the environmental problems, is it traffic congestion, is it geopolitical problems, what is it, macroeconomic fluctuations and exposure of our macroeconomy to a volatile commodity. What is it exactly? Because if you're worried about macroeconomic exposure, maybe the right answer is better monetary policy. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to start building a train system. So, really, I think it's important to my mind is, in particular, if you're going to start talking about policies that are expensive, getting people off oil can be very expensive. So the question is, what are the benefits exactly? What are the costs exactly? And how do you have a rational conversation about making those trade-offs? And that's what I'd like to see in the energy security conversation, in the climate conversation, and all the other aspects of this incredibly complicated industry that's so fundamental to the well-being of our economy and our environment.
And maybe in the wrong town.
You want to wrap it up? All right, we are out of time, unfortunately, so we have to wrap it up. Thank you to our panelists.